The night was supposed to celebrate success, but one new surface narrator chose silence instead.
Before this story begins, tell me in the comments, can trust return after betrayal? The ballroom of the North Star Grand Hotel glowed with gold light and polished marble. High glass windows overlooked downtown Minneapolis, where thick snow drifted through the night sky. The Mississippi River lay quiet in the distance, while city lights reflected across the frozen streets below. Inside, the annual Duarte Global Winter Gala had reached its most important moment. Executives, investors, and city leaders filled the room. Conversations softened as attention turned toward the stage placed at the center of the ballroom. Mateo Duarte stood beneath the white stage lights. Tall, calm, controlled. At 38, the Hispanic founder of Duarte Global had become one of the most respected entrepreneurs in Minneapolis. His company had grown from a small technology consulting firm into an international enterprise that now influenced infrastructure projects across several American cities. Tonight was meant to celebrate that success. Crystal glasses rested on linen-covered tables. A live orchestra played softly near the far wall. Cameras from local business media waited for Mateo's closing remarks. But something in the room had shifted. The usual admiration in the crowd had faded. Whispers replaced applause. Mateo felt it immediately. Eyes were no longer looking at him with respect. They were watching him with curiosity, concern, some with quiet judgment. A conversation that should never have reached this ballroom had somehow spread through the crowd. A private betrayal had become public. Mateo kept his expression steady, though tension tightened in his chest. Across the ballroom, near the entrance beneath a chandelier of crystal light, one person stood completely still. Amara Duarte, his wife. The elegant black woman he once described as the calm center of his life, now watched him without a single trace of emotion on her face. The crowd waited. Everyone expected anger. Everyone expected confrontation. But Amara did not move. She simply looked at him. And Mateo felt something far heavier than accusations settle across the room. Silence. The orchestra slowly stopped playing. At first, most people in the ballroom assumed it was part of the program schedule. The gala had been carefully planned for weeks. Music pauses were expected between speeches. But this pause felt different. No one returned to their conversations. Every table had turned toward the stage, toward Mateo, and toward the woman standing near the entrance. Amara Duarte had always carried herself with quiet grace. Even tonight, dressed in a deep emerald evening gown, she stood with the same calm confidence that had made people admire her during years of charity work throughout Minneapolis. She had helped build education programs across the city. She had organized housing support projects along the riverfront. People respected her kindness just as much as they respected Mateo's business achievements. But tonight, the warmth people associated with her seemed gone. Her face showed nothing. No anger, no sadness, just distance. Mateo noticed several executives glancing between them. A few guests lowered their voices, whispering behind raised glasses. The rumor that had spread through the room only minutes earlier was now impossible to ignore. Someone from Mateo's leadership team had revealed the truth. The consultant, the private trip, the messages. The quiet relationship Mateo had convinced himself meant nothing serious. But it meant something to everyone in this room now. Mateo kept one hand resting on the podium as he scanned the crowd. His voice, when he finally spoke, came out steady but slower than usual. Tonight was meant to celebrate the people who helped build this company, he said. No applause followed, only silence. Mateo's eyes returned to Amara. For a brief moment he hoped she would speak. Challenge him. Demand an explanation. Anything would have been easier. Because what he saw in her eyes instead was something he had never experienced before. Not anger. Not pain. Acceptance. Amara finally began to move. The sound of her heels across the polished ballroom floor carried clearly through the quiet room. Each step felt deliberate. Guests shifted slightly in their seats as she passed between the tables. Some lowered their eyes out of respect. Others watched closely, unable to look away from the moment unfolding in front of them. Mateo felt his chest tighten. He had imagined many ways this night could go. He imagined anger. He imagined harsh words. He imagined a private confrontation waiting for him after the gala ended. What he had not imagined was this calm. Amara stopped near the front table, only a few steps from the stage. The distance between them suddenly felt much shorter than the years they had shared together. For a brief second, Mateo searched her face for something familiar. The woman who once laughed easily during quiet dinners by the Mississippi River. The woman who stood beside him during the early days when Duarte Global barely had 10 employees. But that warmth did not appear. Instead, Amara reached slowly for her left hand. A small movement. Yet every person in the ballroom noticed. Her fingers touched the wedding ring Mateo had placed there 9 years earlier. The same ring he promised would symbolize loyalty and partnership. Without hesitation, she slid it off. The soft metallic sound echoed louder than anyone expected when she placed the ring carefully on the table in front of her. No dramatic gesture. No raised voice. Just a quiet decision. Mateo felt the room shift again. Some guests looked down. Others stared directly at him. Amara lifted her eyes toward the stage one last time. Their gazes met. For a brief moment, Mateo opened his mouth, ready to speak her name. But the words never came. Because Amara had already turned away. Amara walked toward the ballroom exit without looking back. Her pace remained calm, steady, almost gentle. Yet every step created a deeper tension in the room. People moved slightly aside to clear a path for her. No one tried to stop her. No one spoke. The quiet respect surrounding her departure carried more weight than any argument could have. Mateo remained frozen behind the podium. The ring still rested on the front table beneath the chandelier light. He stared at it as if the small circle of gold held the answer to everything unfolding around him. 9 years of marriage. Years of shared plans, shared work, shared victories. Reduced to silence. One of the board members slowly leaned toward another guest and whispered something Mateo could not hear. A few journalists lowered their cameras, unsure whether they were witnessing a corporate event or the collapse of a personal life. Mateo finally stepped away from the podium. The speech he had prepared now felt meaningless. He walked toward the table where the ring lay. For a moment he hesitated before picking it up. The metal felt colder than he expected. When he lifted his eyes again, the ballroom doors were already closing. Amara was gone. A quiet wave of murmurs spread through the crowd as guests began exchanging glances. Some felt sympathy, others judged him silently. But none of those reactions mattered to Mateo. Because in that moment he understood something he had never considered before. Anger could have been answered. Accusations could have been defended. But Amara had given him neither. She had chosen silence. And that silence carried a message Mateo was only beginning to understand. He placed the ring slowly into his pocket. Then he turned and walked quickly toward the ballroom exit. Mateo pushed through the ballroom doors and stepped into the cold Minneapolis night. Snow drifted steadily across the wide hotel entrance. Valet attendants stood beside a row of black cars while city traffic moved slowly along the glowing streets beyond. But Mateo barely noticed any of it. His eyes searched the sidewalk, the steps, the street, anywhere she could have gone. Amara. His voice carried into the winter air, but the wind swallowed the sound before it traveled far. A few guests leaving the gala glanced toward him with quiet curiosity. None of them had seen where she went. Mateo moved down the hotel steps, scanning the street again. Snowflakes gathered on the shoulders of his suit as he stepped into the falling snow. Still no sign of her. No car pulling away. No familiar figure walking toward the corner. Nothing. For the first time that night, panic began to replace the calm control he was known for. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing her number immediately. The call rang once, twice, then stopped. She had turned the phone off. Mateo lowered the phone slowly, the cold wind brushing against his face as the reality of the moment settled around him. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of people still whispered about the scandal that had just unfolded. But out here, in the quiet snowfall of downtown Minneapolis, there was only one thing that mattered. Amara had walked away, and she had done it without a single word. Mateo stood alone on the hotel steps, the wedding ring still resting in his pocket. For years he believed trust could bend without breaking. Tonight, he learned the truth. Sometimes the loudest message a person can send is silence. And somewhere in the snowy streets of Minneapolis, Amara Duarte had disappeared into the night. 3 years before the silence that shocked the ballroom, life looked very different for Mateo and Amara Duarte. Morning light spread across the Minneapolis skyline as the sun slowly rose above the Mississippi River. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of their downtown condo, the city looked calm and full of promise. Amara stood in the kitchen preparing coffee. The quiet hum of the espresso machine filled the modern space, while the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the room. Outside, early commuters crossed the bridge over the river while the city began its routine day. Mateo stepped out of his home office adjusting the sleeves of his shirt. Even at home, he carried the same composed energy that defined his leadership at Duarte Global. Over the past decade, he had transformed the company into one of the fastest-growing infrastructure consulting firms in the region. Minneapolis had become the center of that expansion. "Morning," Amara said, as she handed him a cup. Mateo smiled. "Morning." For a moment, everything felt peaceful. They stood together near the window, watching sunlight reflect across the river. These quiet mornings had become their favorite routine before the city demanded their attention. Amara believed strongly in building strong communities. Her work focused on youth programs, housing initiatives, and neighborhood development across Minneapolis. She spent most days traveling between community centers and planning meetings with local leaders. Mateo often told people that Amara cared about people in ways that inspired him. She once told him something similar. "You build cities," she said softly one morning. "I try to build the people inside them." Mateo had laughed when she first said it. But he admired her dedication. At that time, their partnership felt balanced. His ambition pushed forward. Her patience kept their life steady. Neither of them realized how quickly that balance would begin to change. By the time the sun rose fully over Minneapolis, the Duarte condo had already filled with the quiet rhythm of another busy weekday. Mateo sat at the dining table reviewing documents on his tablet while finishing his coffee. Charts, project timelines, and financial projections moved across the screen. Duarte Global was entering its most ambitious period of growth. The company had recently secured several large contracts connected to transportation upgrades and urban development projects across the Midwest. Minneapolis had become the headquarters for the entire expansion strategy. Mateo had spent years working toward this moment. Every decision now carried greater responsibility. Across the room, Amara gathered a stack of folders and placed them into her bag. Her workday looked very different. Instead of corporate meetings, she would spend the morning visiting a community center near North Minneapolis, where her team had launched a mentorship program for teenagers. Later, she planned to meet city officials to discuss funding for new housing initiatives along the riverfront. Mateo admired the way she spoke about those projects. Her work rarely appeared in headlines, but the impact reached families throughout the city. "You're going to the youth center today, right?" Mateo asked. Amara nodded. "They're starting the new mentorship classes this week." Mateo looked up from his tablet. "You've been planning that for months." Amara smiled lightly. "Some things take patience." Mateo understood that word well. Building Duarte Global had required patience too. But recently, patience had begun to feel slower than progress. His phone vibrated softly on the table. Another message from the executive team. Another meeting added to his calendar. As the company grew larger, Mateo's days grew longer. And although Amara did not say it aloud, she had already begun noticing something changing in his schedule. The quiet mornings they once shared were slowly becoming shorter. By midday, the pace of the city had fully taken hold. Mateo's office sat on the top floor of Duarte Global's headquarters, overlooking downtown Minneapolis. From the wide glass windows, he could see the Mississippi River cutting through the city, while traffic moved steadily along the bridges below. Inside the office, the atmosphere felt focused and intense. Executives moved between meetings while assistants delivered reports and schedules throughout the floor. Mateo stood at the center of it all. He spent the afternoon reviewing proposals connected to a major transportation contract that could expand Duarte Global's influence across several states. The opportunity demanded careful planning and long hours. By the time evening approached, the office lights around him were still bright. Meanwhile, across the city, Amara finished a long meeting at the community center. Several teenagers had stayed after the program ended to speak with her about college applications and job training opportunities. Moments like that reminded her why she loved her work. When she finally stepped outside, the Minneapolis evening air had turned cool. She glanced at her phone. No messages from Mateo. That wasn't unusual anymore. During the early years of their marriage, Mateo often called her during the day just to share small updates or ask about her plans. Lately, those calls had become rare. Amara understood that the company was growing quickly. Expansion required sacrifice. Still, she sometimes missed the simple conversations they once shared. Later that night, she returned to the condo. Mateo arrived nearly an hour afterward. He looked tired but satisfied. "Long day?" Amara asked gently. Mateo loosened his tie and nodded. "Big opportunities ahead." Amara smiled, though something quiet had already begun forming in her thoughts. Not doubt, just awareness. Their lives were moving faster now, and somewhere within that momentum, small spaces of distance had begun appearing between them. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their lives continued shifting. At first the changes seemed small. Mateo began arriving home later in the evenings. Some nights he returned while Amara was still finishing dinner in the kitchen. Other nights he stepped through the door long after the city lights had dimmed. The expansion of Duarte Global demanded constant attention. New clients, new investors, new partnerships. Each success created another responsibility. One evening, Amara sat at the kitchen island, reading reports for an upcoming housing meeting, when Mateo entered the condo, while speaking quietly into his phone. "Yes, we'll review the numbers tomorrow morning," he said before ending the call. He placed the phone on the counter and gave her a quick smile. "Sorry, that meeting ran longer than expected." Amara nodded gently. "That project must be important." Mateo leaned against the counter and poured himself a glass of water. "It is. If we secure it, the company could open offices in 3 more cities." Amara admired his ambition. She had always believed Mateo possessed the discipline needed to build something lasting. But she also noticed something new. Even when he sat beside her in the living room later that night, his attention drifted back to his phone. Messages arrived constantly. Emails, calls, updates from the executive team. Amara tried not to let the growing distraction bother her. She reminded herself that growth required sacrifice. Still, as the weeks continued, the evenings they once spent talking about their day became quieter. Some nights, Mateo answered work calls from the balcony, while overlooking the glowing Minneapolis skyline. Other nights he remained inside his office long after midnight. Amara never complained. She simply watched the pattern forming, and waited patiently for life to slow again. Winter arrived early that year in Minneapolis. Snow rested along the riverbanks while the city lights reflected across the frozen Mississippi each evening. Inside the Duarte condo, the warmth of the living room contrasted with the quiet cold outside the tall windows. Amara sat curled on the sofa reviewing notes for a housing development meeting scheduled the next morning. Across the room, Mateo worked at the dining table. His laptop remained open, while several documents lay scattered beside it. Duarte Global's expansion had reached a critical stage. The new contracts required careful planning, and Mateo had taken responsibility for managing most of the negotiations personally. Hours passed without either of them noticing. Finally, Mateo leaned back in his chair and stretched. "I think that's enough for tonight," he said, closing his laptop. Amara looked up with a soft smile. "Long day again?" Mateo nodded. "But progress." He stood and walked toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As he reached the counter, his phone vibrated on the table behind him. Amara glanced toward the sound without thinking. The screen lit briefly. A message notification appeared. She could not see the full text from where she sat, but the name attached to it caught her attention. A woman's name. Someone she did not recognize. Before Amara could read anything more, Mateo returned quickly. His eyes moved immediately to the phone. For a split second, something tense crossed his expression. Then he picked it up and turned the screen face down on the table. "Just work," he said lightly. Amara nodded slowly. She did not ask questions. She did not accuse him of anything. But later that night, as Mateo answered another quiet call on the balcony, overlooking the snowy Minneapolis skyline, a small thought lingered in her mind. And for the first time, she began to wonder who had sent that message. Early spring brought new energy to downtown Minneapolis. Inside Duarte Global headquarters, The top-floor conference room overlooked the city skyline. Sunlight reflected across the glass walls, while the Mississippi River moved slowly beneath the distant bridges. Mateo Duarte stood at the head of the table reviewing the company's newest expansion proposal. Around him sat several senior executives, along with a new face joining the meeting for the first time. Elena Vargas, a respected strategic consultant hired to help guide Duarte Global through its rapid growth. Elena had built a reputation across several major firms for identifying opportunities others overlooked. Her work often helped companies scale faster and manage complex negotiations. Mateo had personally approved bringing her onto the expansion project. During the meeting, she spoke with confidence, presenting detailed plans for upcoming infrastructure contracts. Minneapolis can become the operational center for your entire Midwest strategy, she explained, while pointing to the presentation displayed across the screen. Mateo listened carefully. Her ideas aligned closely with the direction he already envisioned for the company. Several executives nodded in agreement. By the end of the meeting, it became clear Elena would be working closely with Mateo over the coming months. More meetings followed. Strategy sessions, project reviews, late afternoon discussions that extended into the evening. At first, the arrangement appeared completely professional. Mateo respected her expertise. Elena respected the ambition that had built Duarte Global. Outside the office windows, the city lights slowly replaced the daylight as another meeting came to an end. As the team gathered their documents, Elena approached Mateo near the conference table. "I'll prepare the revised proposal tonight," she said. Mateo nodded. "Let's review it tomorrow morning." Neither of them noticed that the schedule they were building together would soon begin affecting far more than the company's future. Within weeks, Elena Vargas became a constant presence inside Duarte Global headquarters. Her office sat only a few doors from Mateo's, and their calendars quickly began to overlap. Morning briefings, strategy meetings, private discussions reviewing investor proposals. The expansion project demanded coordination across multiple cities, and Elena's ability to organize complex negotiations made her valuable to the entire executive team. Mateo respected efficiency. Elena delivered it. Late one afternoon, they remained in the glass conference room, reviewing a contract proposal. Outside the window, the Minneapolis skyline glowed under the fading sunset while the office floor slowly emptied. Most employees had already gone home. Elena closed the final document and leaned back in her chair. "If this deal goes through," she said, "Duarte Global will become the primary consultant for 3 new infrastructure projects." Mateo nodded thoughtfully. "That would change the scale of everything." She smiled slightly. "That's what growth does." Mateo gathered the papers and stood. "We'll finalize the numbers tomorrow." As they left the conference room together, the hallway lights dimmed automatically behind them. Across the city, Amara sat inside a quiet restaurant waiting near the window. They had planned dinner together that evening. The table across from her remained empty. She checked the time again. Another message arrived from Mateo. "Running late. Meeting still going." Amara placed the phone down gently. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations around her, while city traffic moved outside the glass windows. This was not the first time a meeting had delayed him. But lately, those meetings seemed to happen more often. When Mateo finally arrived nearly an hour later, he looked tired yet focused. Amara greeted him with a warm smile anyway. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small question had begun forming, and it refused to leave. Dinner continued quietly. The restaurant overlooked a busy street in uptown Minneapolis, where evening traffic moved slowly beneath the city lights. Inside, soft music played while conversations filled the room around them. Mateo glanced at his phone again as their meals arrived. Amara noticed. She had begun noticing more things lately. The quick glances at his phone, the longer work days, the sudden meetings that appeared late in the evening. None of those things felt unusual for a growing company. But the pattern had become difficult to ignore. "How is the expansion project going?" Amara asked calmly. Mateo looked up from his phone. "It's moving fast. We're negotiating several new contracts." "That sounds promising." He nodded and began explaining the new transportation projects Duarte Global hoped to manage across the Midwest. His voice carried the same excitement Amara had always admired in him. Yet something about the conversation felt different tonight. more guarded. Amara took a slow sip of water before asking another simple question. You've mentioned a consultant helping with the project. Mateo paused slightly. Yes. Elena Vargas. Amara nodded. You seem to be working with her quite a lot. The reaction was subtle, but noticeable. Mateo's posture shifted. It's part of the job, he replied quickly. She's helping coordinate negotiations. Amara held his gaze for a moment. I was only asking. Mateo relaxed slightly and continued eating, though the tone of the conversation had changed. Amara said nothing more about it. But later that evening, as they drove home through the glowing Minneapolis streets, a quiet awareness remained in her thoughts. Mateo had answered her question. Yet somehow, it felt like he had not answered it at all. Over the next several weeks, Duarte Global moved deeper into its expansion phase. Meetings filled Mateo's calendar from early morning until late evening. The company's headquarters remained busy long after sunset as teams worked through contracts, planning documents, and investor presentations. Elena Vargas continued working closely with him. Many of their meetings took place inside the large glass conference room overlooking downtown Minneapolis. At night, the windows reflected the city lights while the office floor grew quiet around them. One evening, Mateo returned home later than usual. Amara sat on the couch reading reports for one of her housing initiatives. The television played softly in the background, though her attention stayed on the documents in her lap. She looked up when the door opened. You're late, she said gently. Mateo placed his keys on the counter. Long meeting. Amara nodded. With Elena? Mateo stopped for a moment. Yes. We're finalizing the expansion proposal. His tone sounded sharper than expected. Amara noticed immediately. I was just asking, she said calmly. Mateo walked toward the kitchen, avoiding her eyes. The project is complicated, he replied. There are a lot of moving parts. Amara watched him for a moment. She had never questioned his dedication to work before. She understood how important the company was to him. But the tension in his voice felt unfamiliar, almost defensive. She chose not to press further. Instead, she returned to reading her notes while Mateo answered another work message on his phone. Neither of them spoke much for the rest of the evening. Outside, the Minneapolis skyline glowed quietly beyond the condo windows. Inside, a small but noticeable shift had entered their home. It was the first true crack in something that once felt unbreakable. A few nights later, the condo felt unusually quiet. Amara had finished preparing dinner early and set the table near the window overlooking the Mississippi River. Snow from the previous week had begun melting along the riverbanks while traffic moved slowly across the bridge in the distance. The food cooled as the clock moved past 8. Mateo was still at the office. When he finally arrived, his expression carried the tired focus Amara had come to recognize. Sorry, he said while removing his jacket. The proposal review took longer than expected. Amara nodded and brought the plates to the table. They began eating while the city lights flickered outside the glass windows. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed light. Mateo spoke about investor meetings and upcoming presentations. Amara mentioned the progress her team had made with the youth mentorship program. Then Mateo's phone vibrated against the table. The screen lit briefly. Amara's eyes moved toward it before she could stop herself. A message notification appeared. Elena Vargas. The message preview remained visible for only a second. Still working on the numbers. I'll send you the updated draft tonight. Before Amara could read anything more, Mateo reached for the phone quickly. He turned the screen over. The movement was fast, almost instinctive. Amara lifted her eyes toward him. Mateo forced a small smile. Just work, he said. Amara nodded slowly. She did not ask any questions. She did not accuse him of anything. But something inside her had shifted. If you noticed a message like this on your partner's phone, would you ask questions or stay silent? Share your answer below. Later that night, while Mateo stood on the balcony answering another quiet call, Amara glanced once more toward the phone resting on the table, and for the first time, she began wondering if the message meant more than Mateo was saying. The expansion project reached a stage that required several face-to-face negotiations with investors outside Minneapolis. One evening, Mateo stood inside Duarte Global headquarters reviewing travel documents while the city lights reflected through the tall office windows behind him. The upcoming meetings could determine the next phase of the company's growth. Chicago. 2 days of negotiations with infrastructure partners. If the agreements were successful, Duarte Global would secure several major development contracts. Mateo gathered the papers and placed them into a leather briefcase. Across the office, Elena Vargas finished organizing her own files. "We leave tonight," she said. "The investors scheduled an early session tomorrow morning." Mateo nodded. "The sooner we finalize this deal, the sooner the expansion moves forward." Their partnership had grown increasingly important to the project. Elena handled negotiations with precise attention. Mateo focused on long-term strategy. Together they had moved the expansion further than anyone expected. Later that evening, Mateo returned home briefly to pack. Amara stood in the bedroom, folding a few items into his travel bag. "You're flying out tonight?" she asked. "Just for 2 days," Mateo replied while checking his watch. "The meetings start early tomorrow." Amara zipped the bag and placed it beside the door. "I hope everything goes well." Mateo walked toward her and placed a quick kiss on her forehead. It will. He believed that. This trip could strengthen the company's position across the region. From his perspective, it was simply another step in a demanding business journey. But as he left the condo and drove through the quiet Minneapolis streets toward the airport, neither of them realized that this particular trip would soon become one of the most important turning points in their relationship. The private airport terminal outside Minneapolis sat quiet beneath the winter sky. Rows of soft runway lights stretched across the dark tarmac, while a thin layer of snow covered the edges of the pavement. The air carried the sharp cold that always arrived during Minnesota nights. A sleek corporate jet waited near the terminal entrance. Mateo stepped out of the car and adjusted his coat while an attendant collected his briefcase. Inside the small terminal lounge, a few members of the Duarte Global travel team reviewed flight documents. Elena Vargas stood near the window looking toward the aircraft. When Mateo entered, she turned with a polite smile. "Right on time," she said. Mateo nodded. Chicago should only take about an hour. She handed him a folder containing updated financial projections. "I finished revising the numbers for tomorrow's meeting." Mateo opened the folder briefly, scanning the pages with quick focus. "Good work." Outside the window, ground staff began preparing the aircraft for departure. The quiet professionalism of the scene matched the seriousness of the trip. This flight was about negotiations, numbers, and future contracts. Nothing more. Elena glanced at her watch. "We should board soon." Mateo closed the folder. "Let's finalize the presentation during the flight." They stepped outside together, walking across the illuminated tarmac toward the waiting jet. Snow crunched softly beneath their shoes. Inside the aircraft cabin, soft lighting and leather seats created a comfortable workspace for the short journey. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Mateo opened his laptop while Elena organized the documents between them. Their focus remained entirely on the project ahead. From Mateo's perspective, the situation was simple. 2 professionals traveling for business. Yet hundreds of miles away in downtown Minneapolis, someone would soon learn about this flight in a way that would raise questions neither of them expected. Back in Minneapolis, the night had settled quietly over the city. Amara finished a long meeting with one of the community housing committees before stepping out into the cold evening air. The streets near the river were calm, with only a few cars moving beneath the streetlights. She wrapped her coat tighter as she walked toward her car. The meeting had gone well. Funding for one of the youth housing initiatives looked promising, and her team planned to begin renovations within the next few months. Moments like that always gave her a sense of purpose. When she finally arrived home, the condo felt unusually still. Mateo had already left for the airport. She placed her bag on the kitchen counter and poured herself a cup of tea before settling into the living room. Out of habit, she opened her phone and scrolled through a few messages from her team. Then a post from one of the Duarte Global employees appeared in her feed. A photo. The caption read, "Late flight for the Chicago negotiations. Big things ahead." Amara tapped the image. The photo showed the private jet parked under the runway lights at the airport outside Minneapolis. Several members of the Duarte Global travel team stood near the aircraft. Mateo was in the picture. So was Elena Vargas. Amara studied the image carefully. She had not known Elena would be traveling with him. Mateo had simply said he had meetings in Chicago, nothing more. Amara set the phone down slowly. She told herself it was normal. Elena worked on the expansion project. Of course she might attend the meetings. Still, the quiet feeling from earlier returned. Not anger, not accusation, just doubt. And as the winter wind brushed softly against the condo windows, Amara stared out across the Minneapolis skyline while a small question continued forming in her mind. The flight from Minneapolis to Chicago lasted just over an hour. Inside the jet, Mateo and Elena spent most of the journey reviewing documents and refining the presentation for the investors. Laptops remained open, while charts and financial projections filled the cabin table between them. For Mateo, the focus remained clear. Secure the contract. Strengthen the company. Everything else felt secondary. Elena pointed to a section of the proposal. If they approve this phase, she said, we'll be managing 3 major projects within the year. Mateo leaned back slightly, considering the numbers. That's the direction we need. The conversation remained professional, direct, efficient. To Mateo, the situation felt routine. Yet in Minneapolis, Amara sat quietly in the living room with her phone still resting on the coffee table. The image of the airport photo remained in her thoughts. She picked up the phone again and read the caption once more. Late flight for the Chicago negotiations. Her eyes moved to the figures standing near the aircraft. Mateo, Elena, side by side. Amara exhaled slowly. She reminded herself that business travel often included several members of the project team. There was nothing unusual about that. Still, Mateo had never mentioned Elena joining the trip. He had simply said he was flying to Chicago for meetings. Amara tried to dismiss the thought. Trust had always been the foundation of their relationship. She believed in that foundation, but as she turned off the living room lights and walked toward the bedroom, the quiet doubt returned once again. Not loud, not overwhelming, just present. And sometimes the smallest questions can remain longer than the loudest arguments. The Chicago meetings went smoothly. By the next afternoon, Mateo and Elena had secured early approval for the transportation contract Duarte Global had been pursuing for months. Investors appeared confident in the proposal, and several follow-up sessions were already scheduled. For Mateo, the trip felt like a success. He believed the company had taken another important step forward. Later that evening, after the final meeting ended, the team gathered briefly inside a downtown Chicago restaurant to celebrate the progress. One of the younger executives raised a phone. "Quick photo before everyone heads back tomorrow," he said. Several members of the team stood together near the table while the city skyline glowed through the tall windows behind them. Mateo stood near the center. Elena stood beside him. The photo captured a moment of relief after a demanding series of meetings. No one present thought much about it. A few minutes later, the image appeared online. Back in Minneapolis, Amara sat at the kitchen island finishing paperwork from her day when her phone vibrated again. Another post. She tapped the notification. The photo opened on her screen. Mateo, Elena, standing close beside each other while the team celebrated around them. The caption read, "Successful negotiations in Chicago. Big things ahead for Duarte Global." Amara stared at the image longer this time. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the glass behind them. Mateo appeared relaxed. Elena stood beside him with the same confident smile she always carried during presentations. Again, Amara told herself the same thing. This was business. Nothing more. Still, something about the image felt different from the airport photo. She closed the phone slowly. Across the quiet Minneapolis skyline outside the condo windows, the city lights shimmered against the river. And for the first time, the doubt she had tried to ignore began growing stronger. Several days after Mateo returned,
Eventually, the questions could no longer remain unspoken. Truth has a way of finding its moment, and sometimes
and growing stronger. Several days after Mateo returned from Chicago, Amara asked him to meet her for dinner. The restaurant she chose sat along a quiet street in the uptown district of Minneapolis. It was a place they had visited many times during the early years of their marriage. Soft lighting warmed the room while rain tapped gently against the wide front windows. Outside, passing cars moved slowly through the wet streets as evening settled over the neighborhood. Mateo arrived a few minutes late. He stepped inside, scanning the room until he saw Amara seated near the window. She looked calm. Too calm. Mateo removed his coat and took the seat across from her. "Sorry," he said lightly. Traffic was slow. Amara nodded politely. "It's fine." A server placed water glasses on the table and handed them menus before stepping away again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mateo glanced toward the rain sliding down the window beside their table. "So," he said, "how was your week?" Amara folded her hands calmly on the table. "Busy." Another pause settled between them. Mateo sensed the quiet tension immediately. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Amara lifted her eyes toward him. "I saw the photos from Chicago." Mateo's expression remained still. "The airport photo," she continued. "And the dinner afterward." Mateo exhaled slowly. It was just the team celebrating the negotiations. Amara studied him carefully. "And Elena was there for all of it." Mateo leaned back slightly in his chair. "She's part of the expansion project." The explanation came quickly. But Amara was not asking about the project anymore. She was asking about something else entirely. And both of them knew it. The server returned briefly and placed 2 plates on the table. Neither of them touched the food. Rain continued sliding down the restaurant windows while the quiet sound of conversation filled the room around them. Amara kept her eyes on Mateo. "I want to ask you something," she said calmly. Mateo nodded. "Go ahead." Her voice stayed steady. "Are you emotionally involved with Elena?" The directness of the question surprised him. Mateo looked down for a moment before lifting his eyes again. "No," he answered quickly. Amara did not respond right away. She studied his face, searching for something deeper than the words he had just spoken. "Then why do you seem uncomfortable whenever her name comes up?" she asked. Mateo shifted slightly in his chair. "This project is intense," he said. "We're working long hours, that's all." Amara's voice remained controlled. "You travel together. Because we're managing the same negotiations. You message each other constantly. That's how projects like this work." The explanations came easily, almost rehearsed. Amara lowered her gaze briefly toward the untouched plates on the table. When she spoke again, her tone changed. "Mateo, I'm not asking about contracts or meetings." He looked at her again. "What are you asking?" Amara lifted her eyes slowly. "I'm asking if your feelings for her are crossing a line." For a moment, Mateo said nothing. The rain outside the restaurant windows seemed louder now. He leaned back and ran a hand across his face before answering. "There's nothing physical between us." The statement came carefully. But Amara noticed something important. He had not said there was nothing emotional. And that small detail changed everything. The quiet inside the restaurant felt heavier now. Amara held Mateo's gaze across the table, while the soft sound of rain continued against the windows beside them. "You didn't answer my question," she said calmly. Mateo exhaled slowly. "I told you there's nothing physical." "That's not what I asked." Her voice remained steady, but the meaning behind it carried weight. Mateo looked down at the table for a moment before speaking again. "It's complicated." Amara did not move. "Then explain it." Another pause stretched between them. Mateo rubbed his hands together as if organizing his thoughts. "Elena understands the pressure of the expansion project," he said. "We spend a lot of time working through problems together." Amara waited. Mateo continued. "Sometimes when you're working that closely with someone, conversations go beyond business." The admission came quietly, but the meaning behind it was clear. Amara's eyes lowered briefly to the table. "So, there is something emotional," she said. Mateo shook his head slightly. "It's not what you think. But it exists." Mateo hesitated. Then he nodded once. "Yes." The word barely left his mouth before the space between them changed completely. Amara did not react the way Mateo expected. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of betrayal. Instead, she sat very still. Her expression remained calm, but the warmth that once lived in her eyes had faded. Mateo leaned forward slightly. "It hasn't gone anywhere beyond conversations," he said. "Nothing happened. But Amara understood something important in that moment. Trust does not break only through actions. Sometimes it breaks the moment someone admits their heart has already stepped outside the relationship. Mateo waited for Amara to react. He expected anger, questions, maybe even accusations. Instead, she simply sat there. The rain outside the restaurant windows continued falling while the quiet sound of other diners filled the room around them. Their plates remained untouched. Amara folded her hands gently on the table. "So that's the truth," she said. Mateo leaned forward. "It didn't go anywhere beyond that. But it could have." Mateo hesitated. "I stopped it." Amara held his gaze calmly. "Did you?" The question lingered between them. Mateo looked down briefly before answering. "I realized it was wrong." Amara nodded slowly. The response sounded reasonable, but something deeper had already shifted inside her. For years she believed their marriage rested on loyalty, honesty, and shared respect. Those values had guided the way they built their life in Minneapolis. Now she realized that foundation had been tested without her knowledge. Mateo reached for her hand across the table. "Amara, it didn't mean anything." She gently moved her hand away before he could touch it. Not with anger, not with hostility, just quiet distance. The gesture spoke more clearly than any argument could have. Mateo leaned back in his chair. "You're overthinking this," he said carefully. It was a moment of confusion. "It's over." Amara did not challenge the statement. She simply nodded once. Her calm reaction surprised him. From Mateo's perspective, the situation looked manageable. A difficult conversation, a misunderstanding, something time could repair. But Amara had already begun seeing the situation differently. Because trust, once questioned, rarely returns to its original form. The rain outside had grown heavier. Drops ran down the restaurant windows, while the soft glow of streetlights reflected across the wet pavement outside. Inside, the space between Mateo and Amara felt wider than the table separating them. Amara finally reached for her purse. Mateo noticed immediately. "You're leaving already?" he asked. Amara nodded gently. "Yes." Mateo frowned slightly. "I thought we were talking this through." "We did." Her voice remained steady. Mateo looked confused. "That's it?" Amara met his eyes. "You told me the truth." Mateo leaned back, relieved. "Then we can move past it." Amara did not answer right away. She stood slowly from her chair and placed a few bills on the table beside the untouched plates. Mateo watched her carefully. "You're acting like something bigger happened," he said. Amara looked down at him for a moment. "Something did." Mateo frowned. "But I told you nothing physical happened." Amara nodded. "I know." For a moment, she seemed as though she might say more. Instead, she simply picked up her coat. "Good night, Mateo." She turned and walked toward the restaurant door. Mateo remained seated. From his perspective, the conversation had been uncomfortable but manageable. He believed honesty had solved the problem. Outside, the rain continued falling as Amara stepped into the quiet Minneapolis night. Inside the restaurant, Mateo finally reached for his fork and began eating the dinner that had grown cold. In his mind, the situation would pass. Time would calm the tension. Their life would return to normal. But he did not yet understand something Amara had already realized. Trust rarely breaks loudly. Sometimes it breaks quietly. And once it does, it never returns the same way again. Winter settled heavily across Minneapolis. Snow covered the rooftops along the Mississippi River, while the skyline stood still beneath pale gray clouds. From the tall windows of the Duarte condo, the city looked calm and distant. Inside the apartment, the atmosphere had changed. Not dramatically. Not in ways anyone outside their home would notice. But Mateo felt it immediately. Amara no longer argued with him. The conversation at the restaurant had been their last serious discussion about Elena. After that night, Amara simply stopped asking questions. She continued her work with the same dedication as before. She left early each morning for meetings across the city and returned in the evenings with the same quiet composure she always carried. Yet something in her presence felt different, more distant. One evening, Mateo arrived home after another long meeting at Duarte Global Headquarters. The condo lights were on, but the living room felt unusually quiet. Amara sat near the window reading documents for a housing development proposal. She looked up briefly when he entered. "Long day?" she asked. Mateo loosened his tie. "Busy." Amara nodded once and returned to reading. That was all. No questions about his schedule. No interest in the expansion project. No curiosity about his meetings. At first, Mateo believed the calm meant she had accepted his explanation. But over the next few days, the quiet continued. They shared the same home. The same routines. The same space overlooking the snowy Minneapolis skyline. Yet their conversations had grown shorter. And sometimes the absence of conflict can feel far heavier than conflict itself. The silence slowly settled into their daily routine. Morning arrived with the soft grey light of winter spreading across the Minneapolis skyline. Snow rested on the rooftops along the Mississippi River while the city moved through another cold day. Inside the condo, Mateo stood in the kitchen pouring coffee. The sound of the machine echoed lightly through the room. Amara entered a few minutes later, dressed for work and carrying a folder filled with notes from one of her community housing projects. "Morning," she said. "Morning," Mateo replied. They sat at the small dining table near the window. In the past, mornings had been their favorite time together. They would discuss plans for the day, talk about projects, and sometimes laugh about small things happening around the city. Now the table felt quiet. Amara reviewed documents while sipping her coffee. Mateo checked messages on his phone. After a few minutes, Amara stood and placed her cup in the sink. "I have an early meeting," she said. Mateo nodded. "Good luck." She gave a polite smile before collecting her coat and leaving the condo. The door closed softly behind her. Mateo remained seated at the table for several seconds. Something about the quiet breakfast unsettled him. He had expected anger after their conversation at the restaurant. Instead, Amara had given him distance. And that distance followed them through every room of the condo. Later that night, the pattern continued. They ate dinner quietly, watched television without speaking much, went to bed on opposite sides of the mattress. No confrontation, no raised voices. Yet the silence between them carried a pressure Mateo had never experienced before. For the first time, he began wondering if quiet could hurt more than anger. Days turned into weeks. The winter cold across Minneapolis deepened while snow continued covering the streets and rooftops along the Mississippi River. From the tall windows of their condo, the city looked peaceful under the pale winter light. Inside the apartment, the quiet between Mateo and Amara had become routine. They still shared the same space. They still followed the same schedules. But something fundamental had changed. One evening, Mateo returned from Duarte Global headquarters earlier than usual. He expected to find Amara in the living room reading or preparing notes for one of her projects. Instead, the condo felt empty. A lamp glowed softly near the couch, while the rest of the room remained dark. Mateo checked the time. She was usually home by now. He walked toward the kitchen and noticed a small note placed on the counter. "Community meeting tonight. Dinner in the fridge. Amara." Mateo stared at the message for a moment. It was polite, simple, but it carried the same distance that had filled their conversations recently. Later that night, Amara returned just before midnight. Mateo sat in the living room reviewing documents on his laptop when the door opened. "Meeting run late?" he asked. Amara removed her coat and nodded. "Long discussion about the housing project." Mateo closed his laptop. "You've been working a lot too." She gave a small smile. "People need help." That was all she said before walking toward the bedroom. Mateo remained seated on the couch. He had once admired how calm Amara remained in difficult situations. Now that calm felt unfamiliar, almost unreachable, and for the first time, he realized he no longer knew what she was thinking. The quiet in their home no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent. One Saturday morning, Mateo woke early and walked toward the living room. Snow continued falling outside, covering the Minneapolis skyline in a soft white layer. The city looked peaceful. Inside the condo, the stillness felt different. Amara sat near the window with her laptop open, reviewing documents from one of her projects. "Morning," Mateo said. "Morning," she replied. Her voice remained calm, neutral. Mateo poured himself coffee and sat across from her at the table. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the wind brushing softly against the glass windows. Mateo finally broke the quiet. "You've been busy lately." Amara nodded while continuing to read. "There's a lot happening with the housing program." Mateo leaned back slightly. "You're hardly home these days." Amara lifted her eyes briefly. "Neither are you." The words were not harsh, just factual. Mateo shifted in his chair. "I meant we haven't really talked." Amara closed her laptop slowly. "What would you like to talk about?" Mateo hesitated. He had expected frustration. Instead, she offered calm openness. But something in her tone made the moment difficult. Because the warmth that once lived in her voice was gone. Mateo rubbed his hands together as he searched for the right words. "I just think things between us feel distant." Amara held his gaze quietly. For several seconds she said nothing. And in that silence, Mateo finally began understanding something he had not considered before. Anger might have given him something to respond to, but silence gave him nothing at all. Tell me honestly in the comments. Does silence hurt more than anger in a relationship? That evening, the snow stopped falling. The Minneapolis skyline glowed beneath a clear winter sky, while the frozen Mississippi reflected the lights from the bridges above. Inside the condo, Mateo finished reviewing documents from a late meeting with his executive team. He closed his laptop and walked into the living room. Amara sat on the couch reading through a folder of printed reports. For a moment, he watched her quietly. She looked focused, calm, the same steady composure she had carried for weeks now. Mateo sat across from her. "You've been working on that project a lot lately," he said. Amara nodded. "Yes. What stage is it in now?" She placed the papers down slowly. "It's moving forward." Mateo waited for her to continue. Instead, she spoke with the same measured tone she had used in recent weeks. "They asked me to lead the next phase." Mateo smiled slightly. "That's great." Amara met his eyes. "It's not here." The words made him pause. "What do you mean?" "The project is expanding to several other cities," she explained. "The organization wants someone to coordinate the work across those locations." Mateo leaned forward slightly. "So you'll be traveling?" Amara shook her head. "They want me to relocate for a while." The room grew still. "How long?" Mateo asked. "A year. Possibly longer." Mateo stared at her. "You're leaving Minneapolis?" Amara nodded calmly. "Yes." The answer settled heavily in the quiet room. For weeks Mateo had believed the distance between them would eventually fade. Now he realized something very different had been happening. While he was waiting for time to repair their marriage, Amara had already begun building a life somewhere else. The morning after Amara told him she planned to leave Minneapolis, Mateo could not remain inside the condo. The silence inside the apartment felt heavier than the winter air outside. He put on his coat and drove toward one of the quiet lakeside parks near the edge of the city. The sky hung low and gray over Minneapolis. Snow from the previous night still covered the sidewalks while a thin layer of ice stretched across the frozen lake. The park looked empty, except for a few distant walkers moving along the path. Mateo stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward a wooden bench facing the water. The cold wind brushed across the frozen lake and carried a sharp bite through the air. He sat down and stared across the white surface. For the first time in years, his thoughts had nothing to do with Duarte Global. No contracts, no expansion strategies, no meetings waiting on his calendar. Only Amara. Her calm voice the night before echoed in his mind. "They want me to relocate." The words had landed quietly, yet their meaning had been clear. She was leaving, not out of anger, not after a dramatic argument, but after weeks of silence that Mateo had never fully understood. He rubbed his hands together against the cold. Part of him wanted to believe the situation could still change. Perhaps she would reconsider. Perhaps time would soften the distance between them. But deep down, he understood something different. Amara had already made her decision long before telling him. And sitting there beside the frozen lake, Mateo faced a difficult realization. The silence in their home had not been waiting for him to repair things. It had been preparing her to walk away. The park remained quiet as Mateo sat alone on the wooden bench. The frozen lake stretched wide in front of him, its surface covered by thin snow that reflected the pale winter light. A cold wind moved steadily across the open space, brushing through the bare trees along the shoreline. Mateo pulled his coat tighter and stared at the ice. For years his life had followed a simple rule: solve the problem. When a contract failed, he negotiated another. When a project faced delays, he worked longer hours until it moved forward again. Success had always come from control. But sitting beside the frozen lake, Mateo understood something uncomfortable. This situation had no quick solution. He closed his eyes briefly. The restaurant conversation replayed in his mind. Amara asking a direct question: "Are you emotionally involved with her?" And his answer: yes. He had spoken honestly. Yet honesty had arrived too late. Mateo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He tried to convince himself that nothing serious had happened. No physical relationship. No secret meetings outside work. Just conversations. Late nights at the office. A growing connection he allowed to exist longer than it should have. He had told himself it meant nothing. But now, sitting in the freezing Minneapolis air, the truth felt clearer. It had meant something. If it had not mattered, Amara would not be leaving. The wind swept across the frozen lake again, carrying the quiet emptiness of the park with it. Mateo finally lifted his head and looked across the white landscape. For the first time since the situation began, he stopped defending himself. Instead, he faced a harder thought. He had not lost Amara because of a misunderstanding. He had lost her because he allowed his loyalty to weaken. And that realization settled heavily in his chest. Mateo remained seated beside the frozen lake long after the wind had numbed his hands. The park stayed quiet. A few distant figures crossed the walking path, their coats pulled tight against the cold, but no one came near the bench where he sat. The stillness forced him to think. For weeks he had convinced himself the situation with Amara would settle naturally. Time would pass. The silence between them would fade. Their life would slowly return to the rhythm they once shared. But now he saw the truth clearly. Amara had not withdrawn to punish him. She had withdrawn because something inside her had already changed. Mateo leaned back and stared at the pale sky above the frozen lake. Another realization followed quickly. His reputation still remained intact. Within Duarte Global, no one outside a small group of executives knew about the emotional connection he had admitted to Amara. Publicly, his image remained strong. A respected entrepreneur. A disciplined leader. A man known for integrity in business. If he stayed quiet, nothing about that image would change. The company would continue expanding. The investors would remain confident. The city of Minneapolis would continue seeing him as a success story. But that version of events would hide the truth. Mateo lowered his gaze toward the frozen lake again. The thought forced a difficult question into his mind. What mattered more? Protecting his reputation, or accepting responsibility for the damage he had caused? The wind moved across the ice again, as the decision slowly formed. For years Mateo Duarte had built his career by making difficult choices when others hesitated. Now he faced a different kind of decision. One that had nothing to do with contracts or profits. Only character. Mateo remained seated while the cold winds swept across the frozen lake. The bench beneath him had grown stiff with ice, yet he barely noticed the discomfort. His thoughts had moved somewhere deeper. For years he believed success meant building something large enough to outlast failure. Companies, projects, reputation. But none of those things could protect a relationship from quiet damage. He remembered the early years with Amara. Back when Duarte Global was still a small firm working out of a modest office downtown. Back when evenings were spent planning both their dreams at the kitchen table. She had supported him through every stage of the company's growth. When investors doubted him. When contracts fell through. When the pressure of leadership almost overwhelmed him. Amara had always remained steady. Yet when her trust needed protection, he had not offered the same loyalty. Mateo lowered his head slightly. The truth settled deeper with every passing moment. He had told himself the emotional connection with Elena meant nothing. He had told himself work pressure explained everything. He had told himself Amara would understand, but those explanations were only comfort for his own mistakes. The frozen lake stretched wide in front of him, silent and still. Mateo exhaled slowly. For the first time since the situation began, He stopped thinking about how to fix the problem quietly. Instead, he began thinking about what honesty would actually require. If he truly wanted to face the consequences of his choices, he could not hide behind private conversations or personal explanations. The truth would have to exist publicly, not only for Amara, but for himself. The realization frightened him. Yet at the same time, it brought a strange sense of clarity, and once that clarity arrived, the path forward began forming in his mind. Mateo stood from the bench and walked slowly along the edge of the frozen lake. The cold wind followed him across the empty path, while the Minneapolis skyline stood quietly in the distance. The city looked peaceful beneath the winter sky, yet his thoughts carried a different weight. For days he had tried to convince himself that silence would solve everything. If he avoided the situation, if he allowed time to pass, if he focused on work and expansion, eventually the tension with Amara would fade. But the quiet weeks inside their condo had proven the opposite. Silence had not healed anything. It had only created distance. Mateo stopped near the railing that overlooked the frozen water. His reflection appeared faintly across the icy surface below. For the first time he spoke the truth aloud. I was wrong. The wind carried the words away. He knew what needed to happen next. The Duarte Global Winter Gala was approaching. An annual event attended by investors, city leaders, and many of the people who helped build the company. Normally the evening focused on celebration and future plans. But this year, Mateo saw it differently. If he truly wanted to face what he had done, he could not keep the truth private. He would admit his mistake. Not in a quiet conversation, not in a controlled setting, but openly. Mateo turned away from the lake and began walking back toward the parking lot. The decision had already formed completely in his mind. Fear followed closely behind it. Because once the truth was spoken publicly, there would be no way to protect his reputation from the consequences. Still, he continued walking. And as the cold wind moved across the empty Minneapolis park, Mateo Duarte prepared to reveal everything at the upcoming corporate gala. The applause began politely as Mateo stepped onto the stage. Guests turned their attention toward him while the room gradually grew quiet. The bright spotlights above the stage reflected across the polished floor, drawing every eye toward the podium. Mateo placed his notes down but did not look at them. For years he had delivered speeches at events like this without hesitation. Investors trusted him. City leaders respected him. His words usually focused on growth, vision, and opportunity. Tonight felt different. He scanned the audience briefly. Executives from Duarte Global sat near the front tables. Local officials and charity partners filled the center of the ballroom. Near the back, Amara remained standing quietly against the wall. Mateo took a slow breath. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. His voice carried clearly through the microphone. "This evening has always been one of the most meaningful events for our company. It reminds us that success in business should also create opportunities for the communities around us." Several guests nodded. Mateo continued. "Over the past year, Duarte Global has expanded faster than I ever imagined possible." The audience listened attentively. "We have secured new partnerships, built new teams, and invested in projects that will shape the future of cities like Minneapolis." A few guests lifted their glasses in quiet approval. Mateo paused. Normally this moment would lead into announcements about future growth. Instead, he rested both hands on the sides of the podium. "Tonight, however, I need to speak about something different." The shift in tone caught the room's attention immediately. Guests exchanged quick glances across the tables. Mateo looked once more toward the back of the ballroom. Amara remained still, watching the stage. He returned his gaze to the crowd. "For years I have stood here speaking about responsibility and leadership," he said slowly. "And tonight I need to be honest about a moment when I failed to live up to both." A ripple of quiet movement passed through the ballroom. Guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs as Mateo's words shifted the atmosphere of the evening. Public speeches at events like this rarely moved into personal territory. Mateo understood that. "Still," he continued, "most of you know me through Duarte Global," he said. "Through the projects we build and the partnerships we form." He paused briefly. "But leadership is not measured only by success." The room remained silent. Mateo's voice softened slightly. It is also measured by the moments when we fail the people closest to us. Several people in the audience exchanged uncertain glances. The direction of the speech had clearly changed. Mateo steadied himself against the podium. Over the past months, I allowed a professional relationship to cross an emotional boundary that should never have existed. A quiet murmur moved across the tables. Mateo continued before anyone could react. There was no physical relationship, he said firmly. But there was emotional involvement that placed my marriage in a position it never should have faced. The honesty landed heavily in the room. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others stared at him with open surprise. Across the ballroom, Amara remained standing near the back wall. Her posture had not changed. Her expression remained calm. Mateo spoke again. I convinced myself that the situation was harmless. I told myself work pressure explained it. He shook his head slightly. But that explanation was wrong. The room stayed silent. I hurt someone who trusted me completely, Mateo said. And no amount of business success can justify that. The words carried across the ballroom. Mateo's hands rested firmly on the podium. For the first time in his career, he stood before an audience not as a confident leader, but as a man admitting his failure. The ballroom remained still for several seconds after Mateo finished speaking. No applause. No conversation. Just silence. The soft hum of the lights above the stage seemed louder than usual as hundreds of guests processed what they had just heard. Executives at the front tables exchanged quiet looks. Several investors leaned toward one another, whispering softly. Public events rarely included confessions like this. Mateo remained at the podium, allowing the moment to settle across the room. For years he had stood in front of audiences like this, speaking with certainty and authority. Tonight he stood exposed. Across the ballroom, a few cameras from local media outlets continued recording the scene. The story would likely reach far beyond this room by morning. Mateo accepted that. He lifted his head slightly. I'm not sharing this tonight for sympathy, he continued. His voice remained steady, though the vulnerability in his words was impossible to ignore. I'm sharing it because leadership requires accountability. Several guests listened carefully now. Mateo glanced toward the back of the ballroom again. Amara still stood near the wall, her presence quiet but impossible to overlook. She supported me long before Duarte Global became successful, Mateo said. When the company had only a handful of employees and uncertainty surrounded every decision. His voice slowed slightly. She believed in my work and in my character. The words carried through the silent ballroom. And when I allowed my loyalty to weaken, I betrayed that trust. Mateo stepped away from the podium slightly. The speech he prepared no longer mattered. This moment had become something else entirely. A room full of influential people watched the scene unfold with growing tension. Because everyone now understood something important. The most important response had not yet happened, and every person in the ballroom knew exactly who that response belonged to. Mateo stood quietly beneath the stage lights. The ballroom felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were listening to every breath taken inside the room. His confession had changed the entire atmosphere of the evening. Some guests avoided looking directly at him. Others watched with intense curiosity. But Mateo's attention moved toward only one person, Amara. She remained near the back of the ballroom, standing calmly beside a tall column near the entrance. The bright stage lights did not reach her completely, yet everyone in the room could see where Mateo was looking. And slowly, their attention shifted in the same direction. Guests began turning their heads. Conversations faded completely. Even the servers paused where they stood. Mateo took a step away from the podium. He no longer cared about the cameras or the investors watching him. His focus remained on Amara. I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight, he said, his voice softer now. I know that trust, once damaged, cannot be repaired through words alone. The audience listened closely. Mateo continued, but I needed to admit the truth publicly because the person I hurt deserves honesty more than silence. His eyes remained fixed on her. For a moment, nothing happened. Amara stood exactly where she had been since the speech began. Still, composed, the same calm presence that had filled their home during the past several weeks. Yet something about the moment had shifted, because now every person in the ballroom understood the truth Mateo had spoken. And the next moment belonged entirely to Amara. One by one, heads across the room turned toward her. Hundreds of eyes waited quietly. The tension grew heavier with every passing second, because everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. The ballroom remained completely still. Mateo's confession had left the entire room suspended in quiet anticipation. Guests sat motionless at their tables, while the bright stage lights cast long reflections across the polished floor. All attention had shifted toward the back of the room, toward Amara. For several seconds she did not move. Then, slowly, she stepped away from the wall. The sound of her heels against the floor echoed softly through the ballroom. Every person in the room followed her movement. Mateo watched from the stage as she began walking toward the center of the room. Her posture remained calm, her expression unchanged. The same quiet composure she had carried for weeks now surrounded her completely. She passed between rows of tables where executives and investors lowered their voices to whispers. Some guests looked down respectfully as she walked by. Others watched with open curiosity. Outside the tall ballroom windows, snow drifted gently through the night sky above Minneapolis. Inside, the tension grew heavier with each step Amara took. Mateo felt his heartbeat rising as she moved closer. He had prepared himself for anger, for questions, for a confrontation that might echo through the room. But nothing about her movement suggested anger, only quiet certainty. Amara stopped near the front table, just a few steps away from the stage. For the first time since the speech began, their eyes met directly. Mateo searched her face for some sign of emotion, but her gaze remained steady, neither cold nor warm, simply resolved. She had heard every word of his confession, and now the entire ballroom waited to see how she would respond. The silence inside the ballroom deepened as Amara stood near the front table. Mateo remained on the stage, his hands resting lightly against the sides of the podium. The bright lights above him made it difficult to see every face in the audience, but one thing was clear. Every person in the room was watching her. Amara's eyes remained on Mateo for a few seconds longer. Then she lowered her gaze slowly. Her left hand moved gently toward the ring on her finger. The wedding band Mateo had placed there years earlier, during a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. The same ring that once symbolized the trust they built together. Several guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs as they noticed the movement. Amara touched the ring carefully, not with hesitation, not with anger, simply with quiet purpose. Mateo felt the weight of the moment settle across the room. Part of him wanted to step down from the stage, to walk toward her, to speak her name, but something about her calm presence kept him still. Amara slid the ring slowly from her finger. The small circle of gold caught the reflection of the chandelier light above the table. For a moment she held it in her hand. Then she placed it gently on the table in front of her. The soft metallic sound of the ring touching the glass surface seemed louder than any voice in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the servers standing near the back remained frozen. Outside the tall windows, snow continued falling quietly over the Minneapolis skyline. Inside the ballroom, the meaning of Amara's gesture needed no explanation. Some decisions speak clearly without a single word. Amara did not look at the ring again after placing it on the table. Her hand moved away slowly, leaving the small band resting beneath the chandelier light where every person in the ballroom could see it. For a moment she remained standing there, calm, still, the same composed presence she had carried since Mateo began speaking. Mateo stood frozen on the stage. The sight of the ring on the table hit him harder than any confrontation ever could have. He had imagined many outcomes while planning his confession. Anger, public criticism, a difficult conversation in front of hundreds of people. But not this. Amara lifted her head slightly and looked toward him one last time. Their eyes met across the quiet room. There was no accusation in her expression, no bitterness. Only a calm certainty that the decision had already been made. Mateo opened his mouth as if to say something. Her name almost left his lips. But before he could speak, Amara turned away. She walked slowly toward the ballroom exit. Guests moved slightly aside to clear a path as she passed between the tables. Some lowered their eyes. Others followed her movement silently. The only sound in the room came from her steady footsteps across the floor. Outside the tall windows, snow continued falling across the Minneapolis streets. Amara reached the ballroom doors. Without hesitation, she pushed them open. Cold winter air briefly swept into the room as the doors moved outward. Then she stepped through the doorway and disappeared into the night. The doors closed behind her quietly. And just like that, she was gone. The ballroom doors closed softly behind Amara. The faint echo of the latch seemed to linger in the air longer than expected. Inside the room, no one moved. Mateo remained standing on the stage while the wedding ring rested alone on the table below him. The symbol of 9 years of marriage now sat under the bright chandelier lights for everyone to see. Whispers slowly began spreading through the room. Some guests leaned toward one another in quiet conversations. Others remained silent, unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed. Mateo barely noticed any of them. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway where Amara had disappeared. The realization arrived slowly but powerfully. Her silence had never been confusion. It had never been hesitation. It had been closure. For weeks, she had said very little. No arguments. No accusations. Just distance. Now he finally understood why. Amara had already accepted the end long before this night. Mateo stepped down from the stage. Each movement felt heavier than the last. He walked toward the table where the ring remained. Several guests quietly moved aside to give him space. The entire ballroom seemed to watch as he reached the table and picked up the small band of gold. It felt cold in his hand, a reminder of something that once carried warmth. Mateo looked down at it for several seconds. In that moment, the truth settled deeper than any words spoken during his speech. His confession had been honest, but honesty does not erase damage, and sometimes the consequences of one decision arrive quietly, without anger, without argument, only silence. Mateo remained standing beside the table for a long moment. The wedding ring rested in his palm, while the soft glow of the chandeliers reflected across the quiet ballroom. Around him, the evening celebration had completely lost its purpose. Guests spoke in low voices. Some began gathering their coats. Others simply watched Mateo from across the room, unsure whether to approach him or leave him alone. None of that mattered to him. His attention stayed on the empty doorway where Amara had disappeared. The snow outside continued falling across downtown Minneapolis. From inside the ballroom windows, the city lights looked distant and quiet. Mateo slipped the ring into his pocket slowly. The small movement felt heavier than any decision he had made during his career. He turned toward the stage again, but the bright lights now felt uncomfortable. Moments earlier, the room had been filled with expectation. Now it carried something different. Consequences. One of the Duarte global executives approached him cautiously. "Mateo, should we continue the program?" the man asked quietly. Mateo shook his head. "No." The answer came calmly. The executive nodded and stepped away. Across the ballroom, guests began leaving one by one. The sound of chairs shifting and footsteps moving toward the exit replaced the earlier excitement of the evening. Within minutes, the room grew noticeably emptier. Mateo remained near the stage, watching the final guests walk out into the snowy Minneapolis night. Eventually, the ballroom doors closed once more. The large space fell silent. Mateo Duarte stood alone beneath the dimming lights. For years he had filled rooms like this with confidence and certainty. Tonight he stood there with something very different. The quiet understanding of what his choices had cost him. If this story moved you, like the video and subscribe for more powerful relationship stories. Several months passed after the night of the gala. Winter slowly released its hold on Minneapolis. The snow melted along the streets and riverbanks, while the Mississippi River moved freely again beneath the bridges. One quiet spring morning, Mateo walked along the river path near downtown. The air felt warmer now. Sunlight reflected across the water, while cyclists and early walkers moved along the trail. The city had returned to its normal rhythm. For Mateo, life looked different. Duarte Global continued operating as one of the region's strongest companies. The expansion projects still moved forward, and new contracts continued arriving. But Mateo himself had changed. He no longer filled every hour with meetings. He no longer chased growth with the same relentless pace. Instead, he spent more time walking this same river.
Months later, the city moved forward. Life continued. But some lessons stay with us long after a moment passes.
With the same relentless pace. Instead, he spent more time walking this same river path, reflecting on the choices that had brought him here. The skyline of Minneapolis rose behind him while the morning sun warmed the quiet trail. For months after the gala, Mateo replayed the moment Amara placed the ring on the table. At first, the memory felt painful. Now it felt instructive. He had spent years believing success in business proved strength of character. But Amara's silence had taught him something different. Character reveals itself most clearly in personal loyalty. Mateo stopped near the railing overlooking the river. The water moved steadily beneath him. For the first time since that night, he no longer felt the urge to defend his past decisions. Instead, he allowed the truth to remain simple. He had broken something that once mattered deeply, and now the responsibility of living with that lesson belonged to him alone. Mateo continued walking along the river path while the morning sun brightened the Minneapolis skyline behind him. Spring had brought color back to the city. The trees along the trail had begun growing new leaves, and the riverbanks showed the first signs of green after months of winter cold. The path felt calm, peaceful. For the first time in years, Mateo allowed himself to slow down. The months after the gala had not been easy. The story of his public confession had traveled quickly through business circles and local media. Some people admired his honesty. Others questioned his judgment. For the first time in his career, Mateo had experienced the uncertainty that came with personal accountability. Yet he had accepted it. Inside Duarte Global, he changed the way he approached leadership. He delegated more responsibility to his executive team. He spent more time mentoring younger managers rather than controlling every decision. The company continued growing, but Mateo no longer measured success only by expansion. Some lessons required deeper reflection. As he walked along the river path, he noticed a group of volunteers working near a small community garden along the trail. One of the programs Amara had helped establish before leaving the city. Mateo stopped briefly and watched them. Families and volunteers worked together, planting new flowers and vegetables in the soil. The scene reminded him of something Amara once said during one of their early conversations. "You build structures," she had told him. "I try to build people." At the time he admired the idea. Now he understood it differently. Business achievements could shape cities, but character shaped the way people lived inside those cities. And that difference had taken him far too long to learn. Mateo continued walking along the river while the morning sun rose higher above Minneapolis. The water moved steadily beside the path, carrying small reflections of the skyline across its surface. For months after the gala, he had replayed the same moment repeatedly. Amara standing in the ballroom, her quiet walk to the table, the ring resting beneath the chandelier lights. At first the memory filled him with regret, but over time, something else began to grow from it. Understanding. Mateo had spent years believing that strong words could repair most problems. In business negotiations, clarity solved conflict. Direct conversations restored trust between partners, but relationships did not always work that way. Amara had shown him something far more powerful. Silence. Her silence had not been weakness. It had been certainty. She did not argue. She did not accuse. She simply made her decision and walked away. And that quiet choice forced Mateo to confront himself more honestly than any argument ever could. As he walked along the river, he stopped near a railing and looked across the flowing water. The city behind him continued moving forward. Cars crossed the bridges. People filled the sidewalks. Life carried on. Mateo understood now that some mistakes cannot be reversed. Trust once damaged rarely returns to its original form. But lessons remain. And sometimes the most meaningful lessons arrive quietly, without speeches, without explanations. Just a single moment that reveals who we truly are. For Mateo, that moment had been the silence in the ballroom. Mateo continued along the river path as the morning grew brighter. The Minneapolis skyline stood clearly behind him now, its buildings reflecting sunlight across the water. The city felt alive again after the long winter months. Joggers passed him occasionally. Cyclists moved along the trail. Normal life continued all around him. For Mateo, the world had not stopped after the night of the gala. At first he expected everything to collapse: his reputation, his company, his position within the business community. None of those things disappeared. But something else had changed: the way he saw himself. For the first time in his life, Mateo understood that success did not erase personal mistakes. Responsibility remained even after the applause faded. He slowed his pace and looked across the river again. Months had passed since Amara left Minneapolis. They had not spoken since that night. At first he wondered if reaching out might reopen communication, but he chose not to. Her silence had already given him the answer she wanted him to understand. She had moved forward. Now he needed to do the same. Not by forgetting the past, but by carrying the lesson it left behind. Mateo rested his hands on the railing and watched the water flow beneath the bridge. He realized something important: regret can trap a person in the past, but responsibility can guide a person forward. And for the first time since everything happened, Mateo felt a quiet sense of acceptance growing inside him. Not comfort, not relief. Just the understanding that some lessons shape the rest of a person's life. Mateo continued walking until the river path curved toward a small overlook facing the water. From there he could see the Mississippi stretching across the city while the Minneapolis skyline rose quietly in the background. The morning had fully arrived. Sunlight reflected across the surface of the river, while the breeze carried the scent of spring through the air. Mateo stopped at the railing and rested his hands against the cool metal. Months earlier he had stood in a crowded ballroom surrounded by hundreds of people, yet he had never felt more alone than the moment Amara walked out of that room. Now the river moved calmly in front of him. The memory of that night no longer felt sharp. It felt permanent, a lesson that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Mateo understood something clearly now. Trust is not built through grand gestures or public success. It is built quietly through loyalty, attention, and respect for the person standing beside you. He had forgotten that once, and the cost had been more than he ever expected. The path behind him filled slowly with people beginning their day. Conversations and laughter drifted across the trail as the city moved forward. Mateo looked out across the river one last time before turning to continue walking. The silence he once feared had taught him the most important lesson of his life. Not about business, not about reputation, but about the responsibility that comes with someone choosing to trust you. And although Amara was no longer beside him, the meaning of that lesson would remain with him forever.